So now we'll continue with our third presentation. Our case study right now is with Mihkel Zilmer. Mihkel Zilmer is a composer who has most recently been working on the music of Tõde, õigus, which is Truth and Justice, a film that is at the most highest all-time highest view count and box office film in Estonia. So congratulations. Mihkel has been working on TV and film projects, has won multiple awards and worked over 70 projects. So his experience speaks for himself. And I invited him here today for him to speak about his workflow a little bit, about how does his studio work, so to say, whether it's in the box or outside the box. He lives in Tartu. We amicably agreed that he's not going to bring his whole studio here. So the way we will do that, though, is that he will introduce it himself, but basically he'll give you a little bit of a talk through and a walkthrough. So thank you again, Mihkel, for being here. Round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael for inviting me. It's truly an honor and quite humbling to speak between two legends of the industry, Richard and Michael, whose careers have lasted longer than I've been alive. So first, that out of the way. Now, secondly, a lot of disclaimers about what I'm about to talk about. Firstly, if you haven't seen the film, spoiler alert. I'm going to show you some scenes when I talk about how some of the themes were composed and how they were used in the film. So if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. You may want to, I don't know, leave the room or close your eyes, or maybe you have seen it. Anyway, secondly, some of what I'm about to say may sound a little bit like it's a lecture. Let me just be very clear that this is simply the way I work. And my experience has shown that these kinds of approaches work for me. And every composer does things differently. So please don't take any of this as some sort of rule or truth. These are just simply things that I do. And thirdly, I apologize in advance that it's going to get quite techy, quite nerdy, and potentially quite boring, but we'll see. Okay, so here is the film that I'm going to be talking about while explaining my overall workflow. So all of the examples will be drawn from this film, and essentially what I will do is I will walk you through from the very first moment that I started working on it, i.e. when the phone rang and the director was on the other end saying, "Hey, do you want to do this film?" All the way to the very end of the premiere. And along the way, I'll explain some of my working methods and so on. So let's start with, before a single note was written, I get a phone call, and I know that we're talking about the director, Tanel Toom, who was working on this project for a really long time. So for those of you that do not know, this is an adaptation of a book considered by many Estonians to be the most important literary work to come out of Estonia ever, written in the early 20th century. The adaptation is only volume 1 of 5 volumes, so it's an epic book. And the director also wrote the screenplay, the adaptation, and I hope I'm correct in saying that he worked on this for almost 7 years to get it done. Because obviously he felt like there's a huge responsibility on him to not let the country down, so to say, and ruin their precious heritage. I get the phone call, and because he's already been working on it for years, he had a lot of ideas in terms of the kind of music that he would like to hear in the film. So our first discussion, our first phone call, was essentially about the tone of the film. And most of these terms that he told me were something that he'd already thought of, he'd come up with. And the most important one of those was that essentially It is an epic film. It is the domestic version is 2 hours and 45 minutes long. The action spans 3 decades. And at the same time, it is a very slow kind of paced film. So obviously a huge problem in terms of keeping the audience's attention, potentially. But so the director was telling me that essentially he envisages the entire thing as having this monolithic simplicity. Essentially this feeling as if almost time stands still. Later on, when in the edit, of course, we found out that to fit everything into the film, they had to make the edit faster and faster and faster. And actually, one of the main roles of the music became to make it feel slower, to sort of slow it down, because there's a lot to pack in. The other thing is that this is about people working the land in the countryside. The film takes place, so it starts in 1871, I believe, 1870s anyway. And so it's very hard work. It's working against the land and trying to survive. Those were really like the keywords that he gave me. But he'd also thought about what kind of sounds he would like to hear and what kind of instruments. So he told me that definitely the main focus should be on strings. However, several rules that he set from day one. No period music. So don't try to make it sound like it's actually 1870. Make something more modern. Secondly, no overly romantic things, no huge melodies, no themes. He's definitely of the school of thought where less is more in that sense. So knowing that the strings were going to be the main element in the score, we discussed about how they should sound. And as you can see, I've written earthy and grounded. And to achieve that, we went with a lot of non-vibrato, digging into the string, and just overall a sort of very a playing style with a lot of gravity, let's say. Secondly, I pitched the idea of, well, if we're already using strings, and the director was very keen to have these soundscapes and things, rather than melodies, let's try to keep all of those soundscapes organic. So let's use the strings in ways where we really create textures and various colors from the strings themselves. Which is the next point. This is what the director also asked. Can we have something that is often trying to blur the line between sound design and music? Something that is often there to help the scenes, but doesn't really come to the forefront. And also, he told me, well, I've got a soft spot for piano, definitely want piano in there. And I said, well, maybe something else that's also in that kind of direction, but slightly less classical, shall we say, even though it's very classical. But harp was my idea. And then we talked about additional colors. And this also, a lot of this happened later when we were discussing on how to score certain scenes, that we started talking about percussion. And we wanted to have percussion that really fit the atmosphere of the film. So we didn't want a snare drum and a bass drum, although there is a bass drum in there, but processed. So I looked for alternative things that sounded like they were of the earth. I went and got a couple of big rocks and I smashed them together, and some wooden logs, and so on. So this is what we decided. And from here on, I had my brief, so to say, and I could go and start writing. The film at that point, a little bit had been shot. I think he showed me 2 1-minute clips or something like that, but most of the shoot was still ahead. So I was working purely from script. So now I'm going to sidetrack and talk about my general workflow. It's important to know that on most films that I work on, I'm basically a one-stop shop for the filmmaker. I compose, record, produce, mix, deliver the final thing. Now, in order to be able to wear this many hats, which is basically the reality for many composers these days, I find that the key is to be extremely efficient with your time management, and that means that you have to have a meticulously planned out workflow. So some of the things that I do for this. Firstly, my great preference, and I have been fortunate enough on the last few films that I've worked on, to be that I was brought on very early, which meant that I could start writing before they are even shooting or before they start editing. And that is a huge, huge bonus. I'll explain a little bit later why. It does mean, however, that typically the projects I'm involved in last longer, because I'm not just there for the final couple of months. I'm maybe involved in a project for a whole year, which means that some clever scheduling with different projects is needed. So I try to keep the very final stages purely focusing on one project, but also schedule in other things. So during the earlier stages where I'm making sketches, I'm writing the earlier demos, I also have another film going at the same time, or maybe two. This can be a bit tricky to manage, and also some schedules tend to slip, so that's another thing, but it's worked out pretty well so far, fingers crossed. The other huge bonus that I mentioned earlier is that I've written a lot of music before they start editing, which means there's less temp music to fight against. I already, from the day one that the editor starts, I deliver to them a bunch of music, which they can start, most of which is approved by the director by that point. And they can start using that in the edit. On Truth and Justice, in the 2 hours 45 of the final film, there were only 2 temp tracks out of 40 cues, I think, or something like that. Everything else was already my music. So that made life a lot easier. Which also means that I've got music that's approved far earlier in the process, and I don't have the dreaded last-minute rush that so many composers have to face, where, you know, sometimes they're brought on when you already have picture lock, and then at that point, you've got a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at the most, to finish the entire score, get it approved, get it recorded, get it mixed, delivered. It's hectic. My main tool that I use for my work is Steinberg Nuendo. I used to work on Cubase for nearly a decade, but I recently switched for a few reasons, which I'm not really going to go into, but essentially everything that I describe and show can be done in Cubase as well. Now, yes. Next, I'm going to quickly walk you through my composition template. This is where it gets potentially boring for a few people here, but I hope it's tolerable. I recorded this beforehand, before coming here. Can't fully even remember what I did. Maybe it became a bit long-winded, but hopefully it's interesting enough to see. So I'll play this, and then we'll move on.
This is what my blank composing template looks like. Neat and tidy for the moment, with most things hidden away. I'm using a divider in the arrange window to keep utility tracks separated from audio and instrument tracks. Let me first expand the top section and explore the contents. At the very top there is a piano instrument ready for sketching. Next there's 2 tracks of markers, musical and time-based. I use these extensively to keep track of important hit points, but also to assist me track down what has changed between different versions of picture cuts. Next, a time signature track and a tempo track, both of which are pretty self-explanatory. Then a handy track for measuring loudness, although I have to admit that I often look at analysis plugins instead for determining loudness. Following that, there are 2 video tracks. Having 2 is handy for quickly figuring out picture edit changes. Then 2 audio tracks, one for sync sound without temp and one for temp music. Next, there are my mix buses. I've got a routing system which allows me to switch from stereo to 4.0 to 5.1, and these mix buses here are ready for any format of export. Finally, I've got a bunch of VCA faders here. These are assigned to instrument groups or sample libraries and are very useful for quick mixing without messing up effect sends levels as regular group tracks would in a scenario like mine, where different instruments have different reverb levels per mic position, potentially even multiple reverbs. And these are summed with the instrument's direct signal only at the stem level. I'll collapse the top portion of the arrange window now and have a look at the lower half. At the moment, everything is hidden here. I'm using a touchscreen running MIDI control software for which I have written some custom scripts, allowing me to control the visibility of tracks in various ways. It also dynamically displays the available articulations for the currently selected instrument track and allows me to switch between the articulations. More on that later, but first I'm going to show you all the instrument tracks. At the very top, I have a bunch of audio tracks ready for live recordings in my studio. Several microphones are all set up and ready to go and properly routed in the project. The rest of the project follows a more or less traditional orchestral score layout, with woodwinds on top, followed by brass, percussion, ethnic instruments, harps and keys, vocals, strings, and finally synthesizers. At the bottom of the track list are the stems. These are groups of similar instruments, and this kind of grouping is what I use for final deliveries to the dubbing stage, separating out strings, percussion, brass, synths, etc. There are also some sidechain tracks at the very bottom. These are fed by all of my instruments and used as inputs by limiters residing on the stem tracks. This ensures that the full mix that I deliver is identical to the sum of the stems, as the dubbing engineer is likely to use my full mix most of the time, but occasionally will need to reach for the stems, and if both are identical, then he can swap them out very easily. I will hide all of the instruments again and quickly demonstrate the usefulness of visibility functions while composing. Let's say I need some strings. I'm going to bring up Cinematic Studio Strings. For this purpose, I have a button per library on my touchscreen interface. In the middle are the MIDI tracks. This is where I record the MIDI performance. Below that are audio print tracks. Once I'm done with MIDI, I can hit record and quickly print all of the MIDI tracks to audio. I have these set up to mimic the situation of a recording session, with close mics on each section, plus a decker tree mic and a room mic. Printing to audio is an optional step, but there are a couple of reasons why I prefer mixing with audio files rather than MIDI. At the top, I have group tracks for each microphone perspective. This is where I control reverb send levels and do any other type of signal processing that I need. To demonstrate some more visibility functions, I'm going to simulate a composing scenario without actually writing anything. I will simply quickly draw in a few empty MIDI regions as if I was writing a piece of music. After I'm done, I can now hide all tracks without data with a quick tap, leaving only the tracks that are actually in use. Next, let's say I'd like to add some brass. Again, I will bring up a brass library, add a few regions, and hide everything that I'm not using. Using these handy visibility functions allows me to use a gargantuan template with thousands of tracks, but keep everything looking uncluttered and tidy while working.
Are you still with me? Okay. You already saw that one. Let's move on. There we go. Back to the composition. So as you saw, I have a piano track on top of the entire template, and that's usually where I start. Depending on the project, sometimes I start orchestrating straight away, but I find it far more efficient and also musically more coherent to start with a piano sketch. Just get everything out there, 10 fingers, do what you can with them, and then later on worry about the orchestration. You saw the markers, and those are super important. They literally help me out more than anything else. I'll talk about this in more detail to anyone who wants to ask questions about this after my talk, but very briefly, time-based and musical markers, the difference between them being that musical markers stay with the bar line, time-based markers shift around. If you have a different edit, for example, throwing in there, then you can immediately see how much the two have, how much their relationship has changed. And this can save you a lot of time when you're trying to figure out what has changed in an edit or how much things have moved. Yeah, same. We get to orchestration after we've done our piano sketch. Now, while I'm writing, I almost always have the instruments that I'm going to use already in mind while I'm doing the piano sketch. Because to me, really, orchestration is an integral part of composition. The two are one. And I personally couldn't imagine handing just one or two lines to an orchestrator and say, well, do your thing. Because the way something is orchestrated is so important in terms of how it sounds and how it feels. And the kind of effect it has in the film, of course. As you saw, to speed up my workflow, everything is ready to go. Microphones set up in the studio for me to pick up instruments and play them, record them. All of the instruments ready to go, everything loaded. This is extremely important because every minute that you win is more time for you to compose. So to run this massive setup, I'm using software called Vienna Ensemble Pro. And at the moment, I'm running it off 3 desktop computers with a total of something like 300 gigabytes of RAM, and I've lost count of how many hard drives there are, but dozens. It's kind of a crazy setup, and you could do with less, because there's clever functions for disabling things, etc., etc. Again, trying to not get too boring here. But the added complexity of using multiple microphone positions, of course, has more demand on the computer resources as well. So this is currently what I'm using. Now, inside my template, I've got basic routing set up for, it's essentially a little premix. I tweak this all the time, depending on the project. But as I mentioned in the video, I have it set up in such a way that I can send stereo demos to the director so that they can listen to those on their laptop, or I can, from the same setup, quickly switch and send surround sound versions to the dubbing states for my final deliveries. And also I have some processing already applied. For example, some reverbs and things, they're all set up per stem. There's usually 1 reverb per stem, maybe 2. And other effects, each individually, so that the stems are completely separate. And like you saw, there's this handy thing, which I love to do, which is to print MIDI to audio. Things from sampling, like for example, if you know what round robins are, where you're playing the same note and different samples are triggered every time you play the same note. Now, if you leave it in MIDI, then every time you play it back, there's a chance that you'll get a slightly different round robin, which will change the performance slightly. So I like to lock things down really quickly, print everything to audio, and I find it a lot faster and easier to work and to mix with audio files than with MIDI anyway. And the same audio track structure is ready for MIDI replacement. So when I do end up going in for a recording session, for example, an orchestral recording session, then the entire template is ready for those files to just be thrown in there. The rest of it stays the same, no starting from scratch, and yeah, saves a lot of time. Moving on, I showed you the touchscreen interface, so just a very quick video on how I perform the MIDI parts terribly. I'm not a very good piano player, I have to admit. I'm a guitarist originally. But I've added little subtitles just to let you know what's actually going on. So this is done for every single instrument in my template. Every articulation, every playing style, everything is ready to go. As soon as I select the correct instrument track, the setup on the touchscreen changes to display whatever I have available. Because thank you to orchestral tools, guys, but if you have a first violin section that has, I believe, the Berlin Strings main string library, violins 1 is, I think, 54 different articulations, and that's just the main library. Then you have the expansions on top. 54, if you try to do that with regular key switches, just forget about it. And I'm much more of a type of composer where I like to keep everything on one track, so I also wouldn't like to have 54 different tracks, 1 articulation per track. If I need to do articulation layering, which is a very common technique, that's where the audio printing comes in very handy, because then I can have both things printed separately and immediately mix from there. All right, moving on. So, every demo that I make, the template setup already has a lot in it in terms of reverb and routing, and a lot of the sound of what I'm going for is already there. Of course, as I mentioned, it changes during the project as well. Very, very important thing in the way I work and the way I mix is using modern multiple microphone perspective libraries, where I rely heavily on close mic positions to get a more intimate sound, and the room and ambient microphones are fantastic for creating surround mixes if you send them to your rear channels. And when producing all of these demos, the aim is to produce something that is as close to the final product as possible. Again, this is partially to save time, because if I have something that's almost ready to be sent out as a final delivery and it gets approved, fantastic. I have to do very little with it. Maybe I only need to record a few instruments, live instruments on top, and it's good to go. So now let's talk about the actual composition, which is probably a little bit more interesting than all of the tech stuff to some of you. Even though the director was quite clear that there shouldn't be overly melodic themes in the film, we were still looking for something. And after I had that brief that I mentioned earlier on, I read the script multiple times, and it's extremely well written. It's just a joy to read, and even though it's quite long, time passes very quickly. And I read it a couple of times, and I thought, well, okay, I'll just sit down and try something. And I was incredibly lucky that literally the very first notes I wrote ended up being the main theme for the film. I sent it over as a rough demo. They loved it. It stayed in the film, and it got developed into multiple different versions. Although, again, having very elaborate thematic development was something that we actively avoided. So I'm going to play you now some sections of the film where the main theme is the central thing. And yeah. It's very dark.
ilmaasjata Jumala kangeid saab loega soovida. Siis teevad need tema südame kangeks. Ja Jumala algselt head sõnad saavad halvaks. Sest inimese suule ja kõrvale on nii kange nagu puhas piiritus. Inimene tahab kusagile jõuda.
Seal ongi see vargapäev. Meie hooned paistavad. Riiste omad seisavad mäe taga olus. Istu nüüd kõvasti peal ja hoia kinni. Muidu viskab maha.
Alguses seisab ta mäe otsas. Ta läheb, kuhu ta tahab minna ja hakkab minema. Ta sammub mööda teed. Ta läheb läbi metsa. Ta rükib üle märgade mätaste läbi vajuva suu. Ta murrab läbi tiheda võsa ja läbi torkavate oakate. Ja korraga peatub ja saab aru, et siht silme eest on kadunud. Mida teeb inimene, kes on eksinud enam edasi minna ei mõista?
Thank you. I should have mentioned beforehand, and it was actually written on the slides, that so this main theme, it had to stand for quite a lot of things, and it's essentially always follows the main character, and it's about his struggle, but it also sometimes is associated with other characters. It's not specifically about the character itself, but I've called the theme justice, because it is throughout the film is called Truth and Justice, for those of you that don't remember that anymore, because it's been going on for a while. This is really about the demand for justice, for what is perceived to be justice by that person who is demanding their justice. And it is not often what would be the subjective kind of, well, in fact, it is very much the subjective kind of justice that they're after. Let's look at briefly at a couple of other thematic elements as well. So actually what you just heard was the most melodic element in the entire film. But we have a couple of other themes that we really wanted to have a musical strong sort of thing that carries throughout the film. And one of them is this, there's a lot of tension and conflict between the main character and his neighbor. And also later on between other characters. So again, this is a theme that is associated with an emotion and a tension, and not so much with a specific character. I'll explain later how and what this is. It's the string glissando that you hear. Oh, sorry. And the last one, which I'll stop on only very, very briefly, was we're looking for this something to describe, because there's a lot of mischief and a lot of little tricks that the characters play on each other, and actually it starts relatively innocent, it gets pretty serious. So we were looking for something which would we were using it as a kind of an audio cue. Sometimes you would hear this before you would see what has happened, just to build a little bit of anticipation. And this ended up being just a very simple rhythmic idea. Too simple, I think. Yes, embarrassingly simple. I'll briefly play you this as well, and then I'll move on with the rest.
Vahetamine eemalt. Naabri karjapoiss jälle minu maa peal. Ajab oma koeraga Tõde poegi taga.
Tõde poegi?
Ma küsin. Mis need minu Tõde pojad sulle teinud on, poiss? Ta naerab mulle näkku. Ässitab oma koera mulle kallale.
Oru peremees valetab. Ise ta tuli üle kraavi eespere maa peale ähvardama. Alles siis läks koer talle kallale.
Nüüd vahel lööd valudes. Sulased tüdruk. Kõik võivad tunnistada. Ma ei tea, kas ma üldse kunagi korralikult kõndima hakkangi.
Ja siis võitis püsti.
Excellent. Please don't start again. Where's the mouse gone? There we go. Like I mentioned earlier, a large part of how I've worked these last few films, and something that I try to do very often, is to deliver as much music before the editing starts as possible. This could be a suite of music, which is also something that has become quite popular in Hollywood, where the composer writes maybe a 20-minute piece of music and delivers that, and from there they can pull certain sections and themes and things and use a lot of that in editing. Or it could be what I call a scoring package, which is placing a lot of trust in your editor and your director by providing them with the stems from the get-go to use as theirs however they see fit. So some sequences in this film, for example, the more sort of atmospheric ones, I would provide them with different stems of slightly rhythmic elements and different atmospheres and drones, and they would essentially put together what they wanted, roughly chop it up and put it together, and then eventually I would get that back and sort of smooth over all the problematic spots and or compose whatever was missing. As I mentioned earlier as well, this is a lot to do with avoiding temp music, because every composer here probably can relate to how much of a struggle it is to, we've had so many talks about it already and it's been touched on so many times, so I don't think I need to repeat any of it, but it is fantastic when you can avoid as much of that as possible, because that's probably the biggest struggle as a composer on a project. At least personally, I find that's a very difficult thing to deal with. So I can skip right over that because we're all already aware of how it works. Now, searching for the right approach. If editing, picture editing has already started, and obviously you can't deliver all of the music before it starts, and of course the edit will change, the film will change, they will get a clearer idea of what they're even trying to say and do with the film based on how they edit the material. And therefore, it's extremely important that you find the right approach as quickly as possible, again, so that they wouldn't have to rely on other sources. So I try to, with every editor that is receptive, to have as much back and forth during the editing process as possible. This could mean some pretty sleepless nights if you're trying to get the new version to them before they start work the following morning. But eventually I find it pays off because the last-minute rush is reduced a lot. Now, also here, of course, it's very important to always be communicating with the director mainly as well, because on a feature film, typically they're the one making all the creative decisions, unless there's a studio involved and all the other things of commercial films, the problems of which also we've discussed over these last 2 days already a number of times. Response speed, as I just mentioned, is incredibly important, because if you get a new cut from them and you can provide them with something extremely fast, then they've got something to work with and they can start making their new cut based on what you've given them. However, if you take 2 weeks, then they've probably moved on. And it's way too late to even try to write anything to that sequence that you've got, because that's already an old cut. So it's about keeping up with them as they're working. And of course, like it happens with every project that composers are involved in, there is the potential for rejection, where your ideas simply don't match the needs of the film. And it's not necessarily because they're bad ideas, but because the needs of the film are paramount. And that's something I think every film composer should really remember, that ultimately it's not your film, it's their film. And you are there to bring their vision to life. Of course, you have something of your own to add to the mix, so to say, but I strongly feel like ultimately your job is to make sure that they're getting what they want. Kind of the same point as I already discussed. So obviously the speed of getting new cuts and adjusting to those is very important, and the template setup that I explained earlier has a huge role to play in that. And organization and efficiency and planning. I'm very meticulous with the way I name files, or with the way I name versions of things. Another thing is, of course, if you have new cuts coming in that you need to edit your cues to fit the new cuts, then also I try to have a very specific way in which I save the older projects for reference, and I'm able to quickly see what I've changed and how much. Again, I can go into more detail on this if anybody would like later on. And another thing is to automate as much as you possibly can. So in my case, I rely heavily on cycle markers per cue. I usually work reel per project, or sometimes even the whole film per one project. And as you saw, all the stems are ready for deliveries. Everything is set up. So at the end of the day, I can simply hit one export button and have 20 cues exported with all their separate stems, and they're automatically being saved into a Dropbox folder, the link of which has already been shared to the director and the editor, so I can just go to sleep. It's fantastic. Now, a little bit about collaborating with the sound department. Now, the way I work usually means that by the time the sound department starts, the sound post-production, after picture lock, most of the music is already there, which they love, because then they also know where they don't have to try so hard, because something else is already filling the space. And picture editors these days usually put in a very generous amount of Foley and sound effects already themselves. So that is something to keep in mind immediately as a composer. I find that I compose my way around the sound effects. The same goes for dialogue. You find ways of supporting it rather than fighting it. It has a lot to do with instrumentation, but also just the timing of various elements, and creating a score that sort of dynamically works around the other elements. Timing and orchestration, yes. Now, here's an interesting one. On a project like this, where the music is, at some points, really trying to blur the lines between what could be called music and what could be called sound design, it's quite important to also know what the sound department is doing. Because, for example, if they have a nice nature shot and they're going to put bird song and all sorts of things under there, then that might be very similar to that sort of sparkly drone pad thing that you were going to do. So it's very much good to keep that in mind. And also the same thing as with the editor, the more back and forth you can have, the better. Always have the latest files essentially to work with. Otherwise, you'll find that changes have happened that you should have adjusted to a long time ago. And the last thing is mixing the music with the sound design, the Foley and dialogue in mind, which, for example, includes very important Foley effects if they're really truly clashing with how your orchestration is working at the moment. Then you can do things in the mix, reach for your equalizers and things to make sure that those sound effects still have the necessary space and your music works around them. Because if you don't do that, and if you have your music sounding just exactly like it would, you know what's going to happen at the dubbing stage? They're going to pull your music down. So instead of that happening, try and mix it around the sound effects. Let's see. So we're getting to the very final stages of writing this score. Getting close to the orchestral recording session. Before that happens, what needs to happen is a little bit of MIDI housekeeping, and that essentially means getting rid of all the MIDI data that's confusing and can't be easily exported into a score format. Means tightening timings, because MIDI instruments, for example, if you have legato transitions, they take a little bit of time to actually reach the new note, so to compensate that, your MIDI notes are starting a little bit before the beat, and of course in a score editor that will show up as strange timings that start too early. So a little bit of MIDI housekeeping, and then you're ready to export the material for the scores. Now I'll talk a little bit about the recording sessions that we did for this film, which is we were recording at the Estonian Public Broadcasting Scoring Stage 1, which is also known as the Radio Studio number 1, which is a fantastic room. It's been recently renovated, and it's reasonably dry, because that's the kind of sound that we were going for. We wanted quite a gritty and intimate sound. We used the Tallinn Chamber Orchestra, which is a fantastic bunch of people, excellent string players, truly professional people. And in the end, we went with a setup of 4-4-4-2-2, 4 violins 1, 4 violins 2, etc. And we knew from the very start, when we started discussing how the score would work, that it wouldn't be purely orchestrally recorded, acoustic. What are these things? Somebody's getting emails, it's not me. not my computer. Oh, it's a power. Oh, I see. Okay, well then I better speed up before it's all over. Let's see, yes. So we knew already that we would have to do some MIDI layering, essentially for, number one, budgetary considerations, because it was a big project, but there wasn't enough money to, for example, go and hire the 8 double bass players and the 10 celli that we would need in a few cues just to give it that real low-end power. So we used this orchestra and we layered it with MIDI. I don't know if the guys from Orchestral Tools, how keen your ears are, if you recognize your own products, but Berlin Strings is in there quite a lot. So is Berlin Percussion. Yeah, it's really, really wonderful to have these kinds of great sounding instruments ready to go and blend them with the real recordings, which you get a bit of both, really, at a fraction of the cost, which when budget is a consideration, and usually it is these days, then that's very important. Moving on. It's become a little bit unresponsive, I see. Well, okay. Can I read it? Look, I was very near the end anyway. from here on.
We have the power lead, but doesn't reach.
It's okay. I can finish. It's just a couple more minutes and I'll be done anyway. So essentially what happened from here on, we had the orchestral recording sessions. In addition to that, we recorded 4 string soloists, a violin, a viola, a cello, and a double bass. They all came around to my studio and I recorded them there. And we also recorded grand piano. I am lucky enough to have a 1912 Steck Northern German nice piano. That's all that we actually recorded. And when we had all of that done, then it was simply the final steps of replacing the MIDI instruments in the mix with these acoustic instruments. The mix itself was very close to finished already beforehand, like I explained. So the replacement process was really rather quick. And from there on, it was simply a case of providing the stems to the dubbing stage, and then turning up to the test viewings and finally the premiere to see how much the mix had been changed by the dubbing engineer, which of course happens as well. It's kind of unavoidable. But actually, fortunately, they changed very little. And this is my other pro tip, which I already shared yesterday. Be friends with your dubbing engineer. Just go hang out with them, have a beer. It's a good investment in your time, if you can do that, of course. And that's about it. I hope this was a somewhat interesting overview into how I wrote the music for this specific film and my overall workflow. And I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, literally only a couple
of minutes. There will be a lot of questions at the very kind of extreme end of geekness, which is wonderful. I do have 1,000 questions as well. Are there a few questions right now that are just kind of very good? Go for it, Arto, you too.
How long are your working days?
My working days? I mean, depends. Depends on how quickly they need stuff. That's basically the answer. But because of the type of trying to write as much before as possible, I would say I sometimes actually manage like a 10-hour day, but when things get going, then it's more like a 16-hour day.
Sorry?
16 hours maybe when things are really picking up.
Okay.
Bear in mind that I'm working probably on 2, maybe 3 films at the same time, so that adds a little bit of complication.
First of all, thank you. A fantastic job and really good presentation how you do it. What was the reason you didn't write the choir tracks? There are 3 great choir tracks by another composer, Usberg. Why didn't you write
those tracks, like I told you, the director had been thinking about and working on this film for years. So when I came on board, he'd already selected those. He was like, I'm going to use these. That's the deal. And I believe at one point we briefly discussed about maybe swapping one of them out for something from me. But at the end of the day, I was even against it because I found that they worked really well. And they had their own sort of role in the film and yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. When you start composing, do you write directly into your DAW, or you also write on paper sometimes?
It depends. I will sometimes, depending on the type of film. For example, with this, the thematic elements were so sparse that I went straight into the DAW. If it's a film where there are more melodies, more themes, then I tend to actually write them down on paper. How very old school of me. And it's something that I'll just attach to the wall and have a quick look at those every once in a while just to remind me, okay, so I'm using that harmonic progression for this thing or that theme or melody for this thing. And it's just something that helps with the continuity of your score to really give it a continuous arc rather than one of the biggest issues with modern film scores as well is that, of course, you're dealing with writing scene by scene and you might get the scenes from the editor completely out of order. And that is so hard then to try and keep a continuous score that actually has an arc and has a narrative in itself. If you've been given, scene 81 and then scene 42, and you have to score them in that order. So it really helps if you've thought about it beforehand and made a sort of plan for yourself.
Mihkel Zilmer, I think I can speak in behalf of all of the audience. We're very impressed with how you've set your shop up, and that it allows you to focus on the creativity and also avoiding problems later on by investing ahead, be it through a means of beer or a little bit of templating. Thank you very much. A round of applause for Mihkel.
Thank you.